She had been on her knees for 11 days before he noticed her, not kneeling the way people kneel in church, with their backs straight and their faces composed. She was folded, the way a person folds when they have nothing left to hold them upright, when the weight of a thing has pressed down on them so long that the body simply accepts the shape of it. Her dress was the color the sky turns just before it decides to rain. She wore it every morning when she arrived and every evening when she left. And at some point between her arrival and her departure, she would lower herself to the concrete apron outside the eastern entrance of Accra Central Surgical Hospital, and she would pray in a voice too quiet for anyone else to hear. The staff walked past her the way water walks past a stone. The security man in the blue uniform, whose name tag read Clement A., had asked her to move twice in the first week. After the second time, she had looked at him with eyes that made him feel he had done something he could not take back, and he had not asked again. The nurses on the early shift stepped around her without looking down. The procurement officer, who came every Tuesday to collect supply invoices, had once said, loud enough for 3 other people to hear, that the hospital administration needed to do something about the situation at the east entrance. Nobody did anything. She stayed where she was. Her name was Adjoa Mensah Brempong. She was 51 years old. She was 4 feet 11 inches tall, and her arms, when she reached forward in prayer, were thin in a way that suggested she had been carrying something too heavy for too long. She smelled faintly of coconut oil and the kind of soap sold in orange bars at Makola Market, the kind that costs 2 cedis and cleans everything it touches. Her dress, which was not always a dress, but sometimes a blue skirt and a white blouse she had washed in a bucket and hung to dry overnight, was always pressed. She owned a small iron she heated on the gas ring in the room she rented on Amamoma Road in Kasoa, 41 minutes from the hospital, by Tro, on the days when the traffic on the Accra Cape Coast Road was not yet backed up past Bojo Beach. On the days when it was, it took 1 hour and 17 minutes, and she still arrived before 6 in the morning. She had not come for herself. Her son, Kofi Brempong, was 23 years old and had been inside Ward 9 of Accra Central Surgical Hospital for 31 days. He had been transferred from the regional clinic in Kasoa after the clinic determined that what was wrong with him required equipment they did not have and a surgeon who could do something they could not do. The thing wrong with him was in his chest. A valve, the doctor in Kasoa had explained, that was not working the way a valve should work. It was the kind of thing that could be fixed. The doctor said, but fixing it required a specialized procedure and a surgeon with experience performing it, and a hospital with the specific tools the procedure required. Accra Central Surgical Hospital had all of these things. The procedure, which had a name Adjoa had written down on the back of the Tro ticket in her purse because she could not remember it without seeing it written, cost 11,460 cedis. She had 780 she had tried to borrow. Her brother in Takoradi had sent 300 cedis. A woman from her church had given her 60. She had sold the television, the fan, and the small refrigerator from the room in Kasoa. She had 340 cedis from the sale, 1,480 cedis total, against 11,460. She was 9,980 cedis short of saving her son's life. She had gone to the hospital administration office on day 3 and explained this carefully and quietly the way she explained everything, without pleading, because she was not a woman who had ever learned to plead, only to state. The administrator had told her there was no provision for financial assistance. He had said it looking at a point slightly to the right of her face, as though looking at her face directly might obligate him in a way the wall did not. There was a form, he said, a welfare form. She could fill it out and submit it, and the committee that reviewed such forms met every 3rd Thursday of the month. The next meeting was in 19 days. Her son had 19 days. The doctors had told her before the window for the procedure would pass and the situation would become something different, a thing they described with clinical precision, that she understood to mean her son would not survive what came after. So she prayed. She prayed with the specific and deliberate attention of a woman who believes that God is not deaf, but is sometimes waiting to see whether the person asking truly means it. She had been praying for 37 years. She had prayed when her husband left. She had prayed when the landlord raised the rent and she had to leave the 2-room apartment and find the single room. She had prayed over Kofi every night of his childhood, pressing her hand to the top of his head while he slept, as though she could transfer something from her body into his. some portion of strength or health or luck that she had been keeping in reserve. She had never once in 37 years stopped praying because a prayer had not yet been answered. She simply kept on. The keeping on was the prayer. Dr. Emmanuel Asante Frimpong did not believe in prayer. This was not a position he had arrived at carelessly. It was the position of a man who had spent 22 years inside operating theaters watching the distance between what was asked for and what was received, and who had concluded that outcomes followed from skill, preparation, and the physical condition of the body on the table. He was 48 years old, and he was among the 4 surgeons in the country qualified to perform the procedure that could save Kofi Brempong's life. He had performed it 37 times. 32 of those patients were alive. He drove a gray Toyota Land Cruiser with 228,000 kilometers on the dashboard and a pine air freshener that had long since stopped smelling of pine. He arrived every morning at 7:48 and left at a time that depended entirely on what the day had required of him. He had been married for 11 years to a woman he still held hands with at dinner. He had 2 daughters and 1 son, and he had paid their school fees every term for 11 years without being late once. He was not an unkind man. He was a precise man. There is a difference, and he understood the difference. Though the distinction became harder to maintain on days when precision required him to look at a parent across a desk and explain exactly what was possible and what was not. He first saw Adjoa Mensah Brempong on day 12. He had taken the eastern exit on that morning because the western corridor was blocked by a delivery of surgical equipment, and he was running 3 minutes behind his own schedule, which he did not permit to happen without noticing it. She was there with her eyes closed, and her lips moving and her hands opened in front of her like 2 small bowls. He walked past. Then he stopped. He turned around and stood 8 feet from her and looked at her for 9 seconds. Then he went inside. He asked Clement A. at the security post who she was. Clement looked at him the way people look at surgeons who ask questions that everyone else already knows the answer to. He told him she was the mother of the boy in Ward 9, the heart case. She comes every day, Clement said. Since week 2, she prays and then she goes home. Dr. Asante Frimpong nodded and went to his morning rounds. He thought about her at 11:20 a.m. while writing post-operative notes for a gallbladder resection. He thought about her again at 2:45 p.m. while waiting for a scan to load on the computer in the imaging review room. He did not understand what he was thinking exactly, only that the image of her hands opened like bowls was persisting in a way that images did not usually persist for him. On day 14, he went outside. He did not plan to. He had finished his last consultation at 5:17 p.m., and he was walking toward the western exit, which was now clear of the equipment blockage. And then he was walking toward the eastern exit instead, and then he was pushing the door open, and then he was standing 6 feet from Adjoa Mensah Brempong on the concrete apron outside the eastern entrance of Accra Central Surgical Hospital, while the sun made long shadows out of everything. She opened her eyes. She looked at him. She did not startle, and she did not move. He sat down on the low concrete wall behind him, which put him at approximately her level, and he said, "How long have you been coming?" 11 days, she said. "Not to the hospital," he said. "Here, to this spot." She looked at him for a moment. 11 days are the same, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Kofi." "Yes," she said. "I reviewed his file this morning." He paused. "I am one of the surgeons on the team." She did not say anything. She waited. She was very good at waiting. The kind of waiting that was not passive but active. The way you wait when you have decided to receive whatever comes rather than to reach for it. "The welfare form," he said. "Have you submitted it?" He had been the one who told her son on day 9 that the window was narrowing. He had used clinical language because that was the language he trusted. He wondered now what the clinical language had sounded like from the inside of it. If this story is hitting you the way I think it is, stay with me. Because what happened between this moment and the moment the committee would have met in 17 days is the part that changes the entire shape of the story. He looked at her hands. They were resting now in her lap, loosely, the way hands rest when a person is not performing anything for anyone. He noticed that the palms were calloused in the pattern of someone who had been doing manual work for many years. He noticed that her nails were clean. He noticed that she had worn a small pin on the left collar of her blouse, a pin shaped like a dove, silver, the kind sold at Christian bookshops near Kwame Nkrumah Circle. The kind that costs very little but is worn as though it costs everything. My mother wore something like that, he said. She looked down at the pin and back at him. She prayed too, he said. Outside Kamfo Anoke Teaching Hospital in Kumasi in 1991. For 9 days. Before my father's surgery. He stopped. He had not said any of this aloud to another person in a very long time. She sat in the corridor because they would not let her outside, and she prayed every morning and every evening. She did not stop. He paused again. He survived. Adjoa Mensa Brempong looked at him with an expression that was not pity and was not hope. Exactly. It was recognition. The look of one person seeing another person's history without being told about it. I did not become a surgeon because of that, he said. But I did not become a surgeon separate from it. He looked at the eastern entrance door for a moment. He said, "Come inside." 2 words. She stood. There is a woman who works at the records counter inside the eastern entrance of Accra Central Surgical Hospital. Her name is Mamie Essie Okiere. She has worked at that counter for 19 years, and she has seen everything that passes through the eastern entrance of that hospital. And she believes, privately, that she understands the weight of every interaction she observes. She watched Dr. Emmanuel Asante Frimpong walk through the eastern entrance, followed by a small woman in a blue dress, and she watched the way he walked, not hurried, not clinical, but with the specific deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is now executing it. And she would say later to the 2 nurses she ate lunch with in the break room that she had known in that moment something was different. He took Adjoa to his office on the 4th floor. He sat across from her and he said, "I am going to speak to the hospital director about an emergency financial review. I am going to recommend that the procedure be scheduled within the next 5 days." He looked at her directly. "This is not a promise. I am going to try. There are things I can influence and things I cannot. I want you to understand what I am telling you and what I am not telling you." She said, "The welfare fund has a discretionary provision. It requires a senior attending physician to formally request its activation. I have not used it in 7 years. I am going to use it." She said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The question had surprised him. Most people in her position, when offered help, said thank you. They did not ask why. He said, "Because I sat outside for 9 days when I was 9 years old, outside that corridor in Kumasi, and I counted every face that walked past my mother and did nothing. And I told myself when I was old enough to do something that I would not be the face that walked past." Then she reached into the cloth bag she carried, and she took out a small tin, the kind used for storing throat lozenges, and she opened it, and inside was a folded piece of paper, and she placed it on the desk in front of him. He unfolded it. It was the welfare form. It had been completed in careful, deliberate handwriting. Every field filled, every question answered, every supporting document listed on a separate sheet in the same careful hand. She had filled it out on day 3, she said. She had submitted the original to the administration office. This was her copy. She kept copies of everything. He looked at the form for a long time. There was a section at the bottom, a signature line for a senior attending physician to endorse the application for emergency discretionary review. It had been blank. He took his pen from his breast pocket. He signed it. The following Tuesday morning, Dr. Emmanuel Asante Frimpong performed the procedure on Kofi Brempong, 23 years old, Ward 9, Accra Central Surgical Hospital. The surgery lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. He had performed it 37 times before. This was the 38th. He did not think, while he worked, about anything other than the work. This was his discipline, and it had served his patients well for 22 years. When he came out, Adjoa was in the family waiting room on the 2nd floor. She was sitting with her hands in her lap loosely the way they rested when she was not performing anything for anyone. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. He said, "He's out. It went well." She pressed both her hands flat against her chest and sat perfectly still for a moment. Not collapsed, not dramatic, but absorbing the information the way a person absorbs something they have been waiting a long time to receive. Then she pressed the heel of one hand against her eye, briefly, and then she was still again. He sat down in the plastic chair across from her. They sat in the waiting room for a few minutes without speaking, which is not nothing. It is the thing that sometimes only happens between people who have been through something together, the comfortable quiet that does not need to be filled. 17 days, she said, finally. Yes, he said. She said, I want to ask you something. Yes. When you came outside that first day, she said, you walked past me, and then you stopped, and you turned around. What made you stop? He thought about it. He said, your hands. She looked at her hands. They were open, he said, like you were waiting for something to be put in them. Not asking, waiting. There is a thing that happens inside Accra Central Surgical Hospital every third Thursday of the month, when the Welfare Committee meets to review financial assistance applications. It is a slow process, governed by forms and policies and the careful documentation of need. It is also a necessary process, and it functions as it is designed to function, for the cases it reaches in time. 4 months after Kofi Brempong was discharged from Ward 9, walking and breathing and carrying a small scar on his chest that he would have for the rest of his life, Dr. Emmanuel Asante Frimpong submitted a formal proposal to the hospital administration. The proposal requested a revision to the Welfare Committee's protocols to include an emergency discretionary pathway that could be activated within 48 hours, requiring the endorsement of a senior attending physician for cases in which the procedural window would close before the next scheduled committee meeting. He attached documentation of 3 cases from the previous 4 years in which patients had been lost during the committee waiting period. The proposal was reviewed by the hospital director, Dr. Abena Osu Boteng, who had been in her position for 11 years and who had, on more than one occasion, signed documents she wished she had not signed because no one with the standing to flag the problem had brought it to her attention. She approved the revised protocol in full. The first emergency discretionary review under the new pathway was requested 11 days after the protocol took effect. A 67-year-old woman with a cardiac case not entirely different from Kofi Brempong's received authorization within 36 hours. Her surgery was scheduled the following morning. The first session of a new welfare pathway training program for senior attending physicians was held in the conference room on the 4th floor of Accra Central Surgical Hospital, the same floor where Dr. Asante Frimpong's office was located. On a Thursday morning in January. 14 physicians attended. The second session, 3 weeks later, was standing room only. Adjoa Mensah Brempong did not know about any of this. She had returned to Kasoa. She was working. Kofi was working. He had found a position with a logistics company in Tema, which meant an early start and a long commute, and he called her every Sunday evening without fail. She had bought a small second-hand fan to replace the one she had sold, and she had decided the television could wait until the next thing she was saving for was saved for. She still prayed, every morning before the trotro, every evening after. She had not changed what she prayed for. She prayed for the same things she had always prayed for: health, work, the ability to go on. She had added one thing: she prayed for the man who had sat down on the low concrete wall and looked at her as though she was someone worth looking at. She did not know his name. She had never asked. She knew his face and the way he walked and the fact that he had once been a 9-year-old boy sitting outside a hospital corridor in Kumasi counting the faces that walked past his mother. That was enough. Some things do not require names. They require only the knowledge that the person exists and is still in the world and is doing something with the life they were given. There is a particular kind of person the world is not designed to see. She moves through spaces meant for other people. She waits in corridors built for people with money and connections and the right last name. She fills out forms that were designed to take too long. She prays in places not designated for prayer. She is patient in a way that is not weakness, but is the specific kind of endurance that comes from understanding that the world's indifference is not personal. It is structural, and structure can be moved if the right person ever decides to push it. You have met her, not necessarily outside a hospital in Accra, but somewhere, in a waiting room, in a queue, in a corridor. She is the one who has been there the longest and has made the least noise about it. She is the one everyone else has decided is not their responsibility. And somewhere, not always, not reliably, not according to any schedule, there is a person who stops, who turns around, who sits down on the low wall and asks the question that nobody else asked: who does not do it to be a hero? Who does it Because they sat outside a corridor in Kumasi when they were 9 years old and they made themselves a promise they have been keeping ever since. The world does not always recognize what it is standing in the presence of. It walks past, it steps around, it submits the form to the committee that meets every third Thursday. But sometimes, if the hands are open the right way, if the stillness is deep enough, if somebody with the standing to change something was once a child who learned what it costs when nobody moves, sometimes the door opens before the 17 days are gone. Sometimes the structure shifts, sometimes the form gets signed, and the pathway gets created, and 67 women after Kofi Brempong get the 48-hour review instead of the 19-day wait. Not because the world became good overnight, because one person stopped walking. Kofi Brempong turned 24 in April. His mother made jollof rice with fried plantain and a piece of chicken that she had been saving for the occasion in the small secondhand freezer she had finally saved enough to replace. They ate together in the single room in Kasoa, and the fan turned slowly in the corner, and outside the window, the sound of the evening traffic on Amamoma Road came in through the louvers. And his mother pressed her hand to the top of his head the way she had done every night of his childhood, once, briefly, as though she was still transferring something from her body into his. She smiled at him. She had been doing that since before he knew what it meant. She had not stopped once. Now, here is what I want to ask you, and I want you to think about it before you answer. If you had been the one walking past her, not the doctor, not a surgeon, not someone with the power to sign a form, just a person with working eyes and a few extra minutes, would you have sat down on that wall? Not to fix anything, not to promise anything, just to sit down and acknowledge that someone was there and ask how long they had been waiting. Leave your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to read it. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.